Welcome, everyone. This is Angie English. I'm a clinical assistant professor for Department of Homeland Security Emergency Management at Idaho State University. And tonight we are really privileged to be able to hear from David Riedman, in my opinion, the world's expert on K through 12 shooting database, which he created several years ago. And he is the only person that is collecting this data in the United States. And so we feel very honored and privileged, David, to have you here to help us understand this very complex issue. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping so that we can get right to what David is going to tell us.
And Angie, just
yes,
to break in for a second, I don't know if there's an error with the meeting. It looks like there are only 3 attendees in this.
I've got 5, David, 3 attendees and 2 panelists. Probably they'll pop in a little later, hopefully.
Got it. Just wanted to make sure you didn't need to grant people access to the meeting.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so Peter's already raised his hand. Let's see if you have a question, put that in the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we will get those questions answered as we go along. And I will monitor that Q&A thread at the bottom, and we'll work to get in as many questions as possible during the session. I do want to start with a few questions for David. Yeah, but first, let's introduce David. David Riedman is a 2015 master's degree graduate from the Naval Postgraduate School. He researches gun violence in schools and has authored many multiple peer-reviewed articles on Homeland Security policy, critical infrastructure protection, and emergency management. He has keynoted the largest conferences for public health officials and campus security to share his research on school shootings. He formerly worked as the Homeland Security Advisor for the DowntownDC Business Improvement District. He served as a firefighter and emergency medical technician in Maryland for 18 years, at which time he reached the rank of captain. In 2017, Mr. Riedman was selected by the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security for the 18-month Homeland Security Advanced Thinking, or HSX program, during which he and his research partner created the K through 12 school shooting database. And that's where David and I became friends, and I was in that program with David as well, and I got to see his magic and his thought processes as he created this really outstanding database that we are benefiting by. In the fall of 2021, when Dr. Peterson and Dr. Densley from the Violence Project co-published 6 op-eds on school shooting in the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Star Tribune, Education Week, Sun Sentinel, and the Tennessean. In addition to his research and writing, the K through 12 school shooting database has been used as a primary data source in 80 peer-reviewed articles and reports, and cited by more than 1,000 media outlets, including the New York Times, The Guardian, the Chicago Tribune, the National Public Radio, Wall Street Journal, Denver Post, New York Post, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, Rolling Stone, Vogue, Forbes, and 1 million users have visited the database website. He's currently an adjunct professor in the Graduate Department of Criminal Justice at Aurora University and is currently enrolled as a PhD student at the University of Central Florida, studying criminal justice and juvenile justice policy. So welcome, David. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. For a very short time together tonight, I have a few questions that's going to help set the stage for our discussion. And then we're going to leave about 20 minutes or so for questions from students and staff for David. And I think we also have some pre-submitted questions. And of course, you can ask questions in the Q&A section that we'll be monitoring while David's talking. So David, Again, thank you so much for being here. To set the stage for our time together tonight, can you tell us about how you began the K through 12 shooting database, its impetus, and how it has evolved and matured over time to what it is now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Angie. So, as you noted in there in the bio, this was something that was created during the Homeland Security Advanced Thinking Program at the Naval Postgraduate School. And the entire purpose of that program was to be an unbounded exploration of what was the next generation of Homeland Security issues and thinking about the grand challenges for Homeland Security. And as we were thinking about a lot of global and large macro issues, yeah, we were sitting in class when the Parkland shooting happened. And I had been, working across the Homeland Security enterprise at that point back to 2005. So, more than 10 years at that point. And I had never heard of school shootings talked about as a Homeland Security issue. I'd been to, dozens of briefings about the Boston Marathon bombing, where 2 people were killed. But here, were 17 people killed in one instant at this school in Florida. And it seemed like something that was a Homeland Security issue and something that counterterrorism tools could be applied to. And that seemed like a pretty straightforward connection. So, this was a collaborative effort, working with classmates. Then we started thinking about, how would we build a threat assessment tool around this? But once that was sketched out, a tool can look great on paper, but how many incidents would it actually prevent? And that's where there was just no information available. In February 2018, if you wanted to know how many shootings had happened at a school that year, that information wasn't available. If you wanted to know how many happened in the last year, the last decade, that information wasn't available. So how can you define a problem if you don't know its frequency, the who, what, where, when, and why of incidents? Because there's no way to benchmark. Is something getting worse? Is something getting better? Is there a new trend that we need to pay attention to? We were kind of in a place that would be synonymous with having a pandemic with absolutely no disease surveillance and just guessing different treatments. And that wouldn't be a successful strategy at all. So the effort then shifted from trying to work on this threat assessment tool to building as much information as possible and just amassing a collection of school shooting incidents. And then that turned into the project itself. So the first version of the school shooting database launched on the center's website in the fall of 2018. And it was about 300 incidents that were coded for a dozen or so different variables. And that immediately got attention. It immediately got engagement because it was providing information in what was a data void. And from there, the program was ending, but I felt that this was an important project and I've continued to work on it, continued to expand. And now 6 years later, it's approaching 3,000 incidents. So from 300 to almost 3,000 over a 6-decade time period. And those incidents are now coded across more than 300 different variables in a really standardized manner. And, I think the bio that Angie had may have been an outdated version because something that's really struck me is just in the past year, the flurry of publications. So now on Google Scholar, it shows more than 800 references to this data, and it's been used by everyone from security and Homeland Security policy researchers to people in public health, behavioral health, psychology, economics, public policy, people doing international work, creating international comparisons. And it's just become a really important data set to the point that in the past 2 months, there was an article published in Nature, which is the #1 indexed peer-reviewed journal in the world, and that used this data as its primary data source for a comparison about public policy issues. And then just last month, there was a study published in Pediatrics, the Journal of Pediatrics, which is the most prestigious publication in that field, talking about the impact to children under 18. And this was one of the primary data sources for that. So it's come a long way in 6 years.
Well, it has, David, and it just tells me that people are hungry for this kind of data. It's hard to do something about a problem when you have no data to analyze it and evaluate it. And it's so important that you've collected this data, and based on the number of people that are trying to use it, there are a lot of people that are very interested in this topic. David, in the ISU Homeland Security program, we have a course called Critical Issues and Systems Thinking in Homeland Security and Emergency Management. It's 5510. And in that course, we're in it right now, and we've been discussing Donella Meadows' leverage points, or how we intervene in complex systems so that we can have a greater effect on the general outcome. And we've also learned about wicked problems in that class, or the problems with high levels of complexity and interconnectedness and even entanglements. When you conducted your Freakonomics podcast, which I hope everybody has listened to, you talk about a chain of events. The causal chain leading to a school shooting has dozens of events, and every single one of them needs to be a failure for the shooting to occur. Any single success would break the chain and prevent the shooting from happening. That's a quote from the Freakonomics podcast. That sounds to me both an empirical argument and almost a philosophical argument. Can you unpack that for me? What do you mean by that? Or what is it that, when you talk about the causal chain of events leading up to school shooting, can you help unpack that for us?
Sure. So in thinking about gun violence at schools, there are really two different categories that things fall into. There's spontaneous systemic gun violence, and that's things like arguments that turn into shootings, domestics, crimes that somebody's armed, accidents, and so on. And then there's a smaller portion of gun violence on school property that's planned, deliberate attacks. And that's what gets most of the attention. And these planned, deliberate attacks are not spontaneous. They're something that's planned for weeks, months, even years in advance. For example, there were some students that were arrested recently, or arrested last year, actually, and they were planning an attack for the 25th anniversary of Columbine, which is this month. So that was more than a year ahead of time. They were amassing equipment and supplies and making lists and manifestos and talking to other people about their plot. And that's where you get into this idea that you're going to have a sequence of events that leads up to a school shooting. And that sequence could be various points of trauma that students experiencing. It could be the time that they start voicing their grievances and start talking about violence, the times when they start formally planning, either telling others, writing, drawing, mapping, and then they start gathering the weapons and equipment and other things, and then really formalizing that into a plan. And so all the way up to the moment that they open fire in the school, any single thing that went right instead of wrong during those weeks, months, or years, just one right choice there would break that entire chain. So if when this initial trauma is occurring, there was a crisis intervention program and classmates and teachers and other community members knew how to recognize somebody that's experiencing trauma. And right in that point, you're able to connect, de-escalate, and get somebody connected with resources, then a situation can be diffused before it even gets to the point of starting to think about violence. Once it's gotten to that point of violence and the students talking about planning, talking about making threats, if any one person that hears about that takes that information forward and then that information is acted on, then that's another opportunity where just making one right choice can then intervene. And then as the plot gets more and more developed, any single barrier that happens, so say the student is planning to take the guns from their home, but all of those guns are locked and secured and they don't have access to any of the safes or know the passwords. That's a point where now those correct decisions have led to that chain being broken. And that's, really the example in Oxford where every single element went wrong for months and months. There was a student who was in profound crisis, who was experiencing abuse. He was asking for help overtly and nobody was listening. He was asking his parents, his teachers, peers for help. He started to make very obvious, deliberate signs of his crisis, carrying around a dead animal or a dead bird, talking about violence, drawing pictures, starting to talk about a school shooting, telling other people about a school shooting, and getting to the point where in these days before the shooting, you have a 15-year-old where the only decoration in his entire bedroom is the human-shaped targets that he has on the walls. Just complete signs of crisis as he's talking about wanting to hurt himself and others. And then, just hours before the shooting, as he's in the school counselor's office and they do a suicide evaluation, but don't evaluate it properly. That's a failure where the other results would have led to formal intervention. His parents in that meeting, knowing that he has access to a gun and he probably has it with him, but they don't say anything. They're silent. And they're asked to take him home and they say that we're not going to. So there were just all these points. So you could really just make a tree with branches and every single branch can have a way that something goes right and something goes wrong. And when you think about how many wrong decisions need to stack up in a row to get to this point, I think it shows our power and opportunity in prevention, that we're not looking for the needle in the haystack. This is like the Baltimore Bridge. You knock out one piling, the whole thing's coming down. And that's these school shooting plots. There's one thing that stops this chain to lead to violence, and the entire thing can unravel. I think you're on mute there, Angie.
Thank you, David. My dog was barking in the back. And so Miss Ruby's trying to join our webinar. So, this has been happening for such a long time, and it seems, and you can tell me if I'm right or off track, but it seems like not a whole lot of movement in solving this problem, because we are April 2024, we're 25 years after Columbine. And you recently said that Columbine wasn't the first school shooting. However, it was the most influential school shooting. And your research shows that at least 23 subsequent planned attacks at schools share direct connections, including weapons, clothing, songs, symbols, and using two of the shooters' names. How do you think that we still see what we are seeing with this kind of behavior?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that there has been some research into trying to understand galvanizing events and events that that are impetus for change, and that can be for good or bad. There are lots of major crises that don't evoke action. And then there can be the same crisis and it kind of changes everything. Well, what's interesting about Columbine is in a lot of research and a lot of public discourse, there's a thought that Columbine was this starting point and that Columbine changed everything. But a lot of the elements of Columbine that it's known for were things that were taken from prior incidents. So I think the black trench coat is really the most iconic symbol of Columbine. But in the 2 years before it, there were 3 other shootings that involved black trench coats in schools. And looking at those, the first that I was able to find was back in 1983. So, 15 years before Columbine. And it's a student who talked about violence, who had really made some overt threats, and he was wearing a trench coat with a gun under it, and he walked to the front of the classroom and killed the teacher in front of the class, and that got a lot of attention in the 80s, and that led into really the creation of school shooting lore and stories and imagery. There's a book published in the mid-80s under one of Stephen King's pseudonym names called Rage. And it's a book that portrays the details of a school shooting very graphically. And that book became something that was referenced directly by school shooters through the early 90s, to the point of that book being banned. But that was, really, it was a already kind of culturally known and understood phenomenon. By the time you got into the 80s for Stephen King to write a book about it. So, that's all occurring 20 years before Columbine. I wanted to search further back in history. And throughout the 70s, there were planned attacks at schools, and then back into the 60s. And unfortunately, I've stopped in the mid 60s. 1966 seemed like an appropriate starting point because that's the bell tower shooting at the University of Austin, which is kind of thought of as one of the first school shootings of the modern era. And the newspaper archives get really spotty once you get into the early 60s. But there's a recent project that I was discussing with the history department at a university where they have a proprietary archive of small community and historically Black newspapers back to the 60s, 50s, and even like 40s. And so this may be something that we take back even further, because really the modern era of education started with Brown v. Board of Education, and then the modern culture around urbanism and gun ownership in urban areas really started to flourish after the return of people from World War II and the changing organization of America's cities, but also the proliferation of weapons through normal citizens, after the war. So that's probably going to be the eventual starting point of this project, because the only way to really understand an issue is to try to look at it through as many different historical lenses as possible. And each one of those allows you to unpack different narratives and kind of dispel different sets of myths. And kind of the last point on that is, I think that there's so much discourse around social media really being an impetus and a driver, or changes in the media being an impetus or a driver. But there were planned attacks in the 1960s and 1970s before the internet was even thought of, when Pong was the only video game, when there had never been an R-rated movie. Yet you could take the circumstances of those incidents and align them against a current shooting, and they'd be nearly identical.
Well, we've kind of touched on this as you've been talking, David. I think about responsibility and accountability. Who has ultimate responsibility and accountability for what we're seeing? For the first time recently, we saw 2 parents being held accountable for their 15-year-old son's behavior. They were both convicted of involuntary manslaughter for the 2021 Michigan school shooting. Can you talk a little bit about what led up to this, and how can we as leadership, community, and school leadership in particular intervene at the chain of events level?
The parents being convicted of involuntary manslaughter is really a landmark case. There have been parents that have a share in the responsibility of almost every one of these planned attacks at a school over the last 60 years. And this was, I think, the first time where all of the circumstances, all of the things that I talked about in that chain of events leading up to the attack were just so egregious that it was something where you couldn't deny that there was parental responsibility there. And I think at the community level, there are a couple pieces that could prevent almost all of these incidents. Any shooting that's carried out by somebody under 18 is carried out by somebody that can't legally go into a store and purchase a gun. So that's not a political issue. It's not a Second Amendment issue. It's just a fact that if somebody's too young to purchase a gun on their own, it means that they have to get the gun from elsewhere. And if they get the gun from elsewhere, that means that there is a legal owner that did not properly account for that weapon. And so I think that education at the community level about the risks, potential consequences, and implications of not having firearms really stored in a secure manner is the first step in this. Understanding that every single gun owner has the power to prevent a school shooting by making sure that all of their weapons are safely and securely stored. I think the second piece there, which is really missing, is community level crisis intervention. And crisis intervention is not something that requires a degree in psychology or a social worker. Crisis intervention is noticing that a person has changed, noticing that a person is experiencing trauma, noticing that a person is asking for help. And what a crisis intervention program is at different levels providing education to people around that awareness, so that within a school, every student knows how to look for a classmate who's in crisis. The next level above that would be a teacher who has had training in what to do when a student comes to them and who to talk to at the school. So you have a very clear line of reporting. And then at the higher level, at the administrative level, you would know all of your resources and you would have procedures for what to do based on different sets of circumstances. And none of that costs very much money at all, because it's just giving minimal amounts of training to existing people and teaching them how to connect to resources that are already there. And then the last part of that is having a continuous kind of feedback loop, so that something doesn't just get said once, and then if it doesn't get acted on, it's lost, that you're continuing to come back, that you're continuing to follow up. And, that would prevent, nearly all of these attacks. So, on one side, you limit the access of a child or teenager to a weapon. And on the other side, you help identify somebody who's experiencing crisis.
I think that is so important, and two very valuable points as we try to wrap our heads and hearts around what we in leadership can do as first responders, as Homeland Security experts, as emergency managers, and as community leaders. So this is my last question, and then I'm going to pivot to some of the questions that have come in through the chat. David, based on your extensive research on school shootings, which you've tracked from 1960 to the present, What stands out to you from the data that we could learn from, or what we have not learned from?
Yeah, and I'll actually just share an image here.
Great.
So this is a graphic that put together. Let me see if I can make it larger. Yeah, can you see that well?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so this is from looking at these hundreds of different planned attacks, the types of factors that are involved in motivating the perpetrator. And there could be just one, or there could be a combination, or there could be, all of them. And there also are dozens or hundreds or thousands of students that might have many of these, but never get to the point of committing violence. So I think that what's interesting is there's this really complex array of different factors. They could be somebody who's purely suicidal and they're asking for help, not getting it. They're blaming the school for the way they feel. And they decide that they're going to commit a very violent public suicide by killing other people before they kill themselves. And that could be the only point, but it might be connected with being bullied or being abused. And those two elements go into somebody feeling like their life has no worth and they want to hurt other people that hurt them and then kill themselves. But maybe they're not suicidal. Maybe they're upset about the bullying and abuse and they target other bullies, but then they just surrender. It could go a completely different direction. There could be somebody that has really not sustained a lot of trauma. In the case of the Columbine shooters, they were not bullied. They were bullies themselves. They were really looking for fame in some ways. They wanted this to be very public, but they had deep roots in kind of the anti-government movement and domestic terrorism in the 1990s. So Columbine was planned to be a bigger bombing than Oklahoma City, which was, in 1996. And Columbine was, planned to be a bombing, but when the bombs didn't go off, it turned into a shooting. Well, Oklahoma City was a direct response to Waco, which came after Ruby Ridge, which is rooted in the nexus of kind of the white nationalist movement, the anti-government movement, certainly domestic terrorism. And where this gets really interesting is where the intersection of hate is there. And there's, the neo-Nazi groups are kind of connected to all of those white nationalist anti-government groups. And the godfather of the American neo-Nazi movement in the 60s started writing an anthology of essays. And in one of his earliest essays from the 1960s, he's talking about being a teenager and wanting to commit a school shooting and kill the principal and kill the other administrators, because that was his way to keep authority from controlling him. So it's a really complicated set here. And then there are also there's some acute mental illness. There are some shooters that are in a period of psychosis during the shooting. They're completely detached from reality. This was more prevalent in the 1970s and 80s. That was right after the period of deinstitutionalization, when a lot of people that were severely mentally ill were just back out in the world without treatment. But then there have also been some shootings that are a teenager where problems at school, it could be grades, a suspension, an expulsion, creates this break in their life course. So thinking about the theory of life course in sociology, that you are moving from one step to the next through the things that you expected or expected of you. Well, if all of a sudden you fail a class, or you fail multiple classes, or you get suspended or expelled, that could be this acute break in your life course where you no longer have any clear direction. And that could resort to violence and taking out that violence against the school that you now feel wronged you. And then, you know, at the complete other end of that, there's also some nihilism and complete randomness in this. A couple of years ago, there was a sniper that fired 300 rounds at the Edmund Burke School in Washington, D.C. And he was in the 5th floor apartment across from the school. He had 6 rifles, 1,000 rounds of ammo, and he just opened fire on the school before dismissal. And this was a person that had no connection whatsoever to the school, had no history of violence, didn't provide any explanation, didn't leave a manifesto, and just committed this shooting, committed the Las Vegas Harvest Festival shooting at a school for no apparent reason. And then there was, you know, just a couple weeks before the shooting in Parkland, there was a shooting at a school in Marshall County, Kentucky. And the kid said that he committed the shooting because he thought, you know, that life didn't really have any purpose. He was a nihilist. And he actually was flipping a coin to decide whether he was going to commit the shooting that day. So the point of that long-winded explanation about all of these different gumballs is that looking at 230 planned attacks over 60 years, looking at almost 300 incidents of gun violence on school property, there's an incredible amount of randomness. And there are all of these different factors where every one of them could be present, but not necessarily any of them or any combination of them are actually a predictor of violence.
It is extremely, I use the word entanglement when I ask one of my questions, because all of these issues, not only are they interconnected, but they seem to be so entangled that it's hard to unravel them. We have a question from Dr. David Brannon. We were able to get Dr. David Brannon at Idaho State University. We're so pleased. He is a renowned expert, terrorism expert, and I believe one of our professors at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security's got a great question here, David, for you. He says, I have followed Mr. Riedman's career from before he started the database, and I agree with Angie. He is the world's leader in school shooting data collection and analysis. Given his leadership and insight in the discipline, and tragically, these school shootings is a discipline of its own, I would like to know how the analysis is informing policy and training. He also goes on to say, I have a history of providing research-based analysis to government and industry, but have found that grant-funded training is often very slow to be impacted by that research. Is that true in this space, or are you being met with an openness to change its existing training and policy, such as tactics, mental health, school administration, or policy? If you have experienced pushbacks on this critical aspect, what can or should be done to change that? So there's a lot there, David. I could repeat any of those questions, but the first one was, I would like to know how the analysis is informing policy, and then the other about how your research is being impacted by leadership or any pushback from that, and or on any critical aspect of what you've been doing.
Yeah, I think I'll take those questions in reverse order. So school security as an industry has existed, you know, roughly since Columbine in 1999. There were not school security experts. There were not lockdown plans. There were not school security assessments really before Columbine. That may not have changed everything in terms of shootings, but it did change things in terms of having a discipline of school security. But if you think about where this discussion started, that in 2018, we couldn't tell you whether school shootings were getting worse or better, or what the characteristics of these attacks were, then what were all of the school security plans and training and procedures and products created between 1999 and 2018 based on? And if there wasn't any data and empirical evidence that they were based on, they were just people's assumptions of what might be a good idea. And a really dangerous situation is when assumptions become institutionalized into standards. And I think that that's an issue that's happened in the school security world, is that things are taken as a standard. Things like the classroom lockdown. There's never been an empirical study into whether that's the best action that should be taken at a school, or whether you should follow the guidance in every single public place, which is you get as far away from any sort of danger as possible. That's what we know intuitively in our physiology. There's not, fight or flight or hide. There's fight or flight. We have two options biologically, but an industry was created around some others, some things around the fortification of a building. Well, what exactly are you fortifying the building against? And that brings me to the power of where this data could go. So, looking at 230 different planned attacks, there's this term active shooter, and nobody really knows what it means. There's no common definition of what an active shooter is. No commonly understood definition of an active shooter. School shooting is not even something that's defined anywhere legally. But what I have seen from looking at 230 incidents is that there are 7 distinctly different attack types. And an insider attack, which is committed by somebody who's allowed to be in the school, like a current student, requires a completely different set of preparedness and procedures and training from a frontal assault by a heavily armed and armored person who's not permitted to be in the building. And those two would require completely different procedures from a sniper, where somebody's firing from a distance at the building. A pretty common circumstance in schools is attacks that are an assassination or an ambush, because a school is a very predictable environment where people come and go at exactly the same times and exactly the same places. And if you want to target a specific group of people, you can know that right after second period, they're walking out of the side door to go to the basketball court for gym class. You can know that the school is going to dismiss at 2:40 and people are going to be coming out of the front door. In case 5 here, I think this is one of the most important historical findings, is before Columbine, from 1966 through the mid-90s, there were more hostage situations at schools than there were indiscriminate shootings with the intent to kill as many people as possible. And that aligns with what was going on around the world. There were hostage standoffs and hostage crises across the globe through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's something that has subsided at schools. Now the idea of going in to kill people is more attractive to somebody than taking hostages for multiple hours. But with just about everything in Homeland Security and preparedness, what's old is new again. What's the next trend? What's the next way that things change? What's the way that somebody that has deep grievances against the government gets attention? It can be taking a school full of kids hostage. That's what happened in the 1980s in Cokeville, Wyoming. There was a couple that had anti-government ideology, and they took about 200 kids hostage inside an elementary school for about 8 hours. And the hostage crisis ended when they accidentally detonated some gasoline bombs that they had strapped to themselves and staged around the school. And there were about 70 kids that were severely burned. And then the husband and wife killed each other before the police were able to come in. But that was a very serious situation for a long period of time. Barricades, in Uvalde, the situation was confused with a barricade. But barricades at schools are actually something that has occurred where somebody who's armed seals themselves inside a room, inside an office, sometimes a classroom, sometimes other area. And their intent is not to hurt anyone else there. It's to stay in that place for as long as possible. And that requires a different response from the way law enforcement trains for the active shooter. And then what I worry about the most is the complex coordinated attack. And that's where somebody understands the procedures at the school and has a multi-pronged attack that is using those security procedures against them. A student who knows that a report of a threat will cause a lockdown. And once students are in classrooms, then they'll be barricading inside those classrooms. Well, when students are barricading inside of rooms, and if there are rooms that have ballistic glass or ballistic film on the windows, there's no way to get out the windows. The doors now barricaded. What happens when that student knows that plan and sets a fire or releases explosives or has pipe bombs or goes back to what the original plan of Columbine was? And that's my hope, that this real data analysis, that this real information can inform training for every one of these scenarios, because the single shooter insider, that student who's allowed to be in the school, who knows how to bypass security, who understands the plan, is the most common circumstance. The situation that gets a lot of attention is the frontal assault. This thought that there's this heavily armed outsider that we need to keep out. But in reality, it's somebody who is allowed to be there that's almost 3 times as likely to commit that shooting. And this is just a box and whiskers plot showing the number of victims for these different attacks. And your single shooter insider attacks usually are fewer victims, but there is a large amount of deviation in this, where the frontal assaults are predictably slightly more severe, but they don't have as many extremes. And then just the last piece here is like thinking about this in the historical context. So these are those different attack types spread across the last 60 years. And on the y-axis, you can see the number of victims. The x-axis is chronology, and then they're colored by the attack types. All different types of attacks happening with different severity across all of these different years. There's not linear patterns. There's not clustering that would suggest that there's acute copycat or some sort of social contagion that occurs. This is just a very complicated problem that doesn't have one solution, can't have one single response plan, and doesn't have a single social factor or time period that explains it.
David, everything that you have just showed us in the few slides that you have, it just really brings home how profoundly important it is for us to have this data. We talk about how to make sense of complex events, and we talk about sense making, or how we make sense of the world so we can act in it. And this data is going to be such an important keystone for us as we go forward in addressing this big issue. I have another question that came in from Lori Holeen. Her question is, Sandy Hook was another watershed incident in which we saw a massacre at a grade school. Even though security measures had begun at high school and college campuses, it was uncommon in elementary school. There still seems to be no common baseline security on school campuses. There are also extracurricular and sporting activities that take place on school premises. Who owns this issue at the national level? And do you have any insights on new approaches or policies on the horizon?
Yeah, those are some very good questions. Lori, the first one, who owns this? The problem is that nobody owns this. That's why there's not comprehensive data that exists on this topic. For things as simple as standard sets of security best practices, standard sets of training for the competencies that school resource officers should have, or a school threat assessment member, or even a school counselor, a playbook for what to do under different circumstances. I published a peer-reviewed paper 2 years ago that was looking at about 3,000 school shooting threats from the year before COVID, the COVID year, and the year after COVID, to try to understand the characteristics of these threats, what actions were taken, what the outcomes were, and they're completely different across the board. And part of the problem with that is when there's no common playbook and there's no common training, every single school is just left on their own to decide what the best and appropriate actions to take are. At the Oxford, Michigan school district, you had a counselor who was doing this suicide assessment that didn't really have any formal training in how to do that properly. You had a school threat assessment team that existed on paper, but they had never held a single training session through their entire existence. And that's because there's no oversight. There's no kind of governing board for any of this. And there's not a backstop where if somebody's not really sure what to do in a situation, if that guidance counselor is in the office and kind of looking at these circumstances, there's not a hotline that you can pick up and call. And that's what's so different from the way that our country has committed to preventing terrorism. If a small town cop makes a traffic stop and there's something that they think is suspicious, they can be connected to a joint terrorism task force within seconds, and there can be people from the FBI involved and investigating, almost immediately. When a school is faced with threats, it's the network and competencies and experience and procedures that school has or doesn't have that are ultimately going to decide how that's handled. And then when shootings do occur, these same breakdowns in competency and training and standards are apparent as well. The Uvalde had a dedicated school district police department. They had no standard training. They had no written standard operating procedures, and the officers were not even regularly inside patrolling, knowing the layouts, knowing the configurations, knowing where the keys are, and so on, within their schools in a tiny little school district. So I think that's really the fundamental challenge with this issue is there's no national guidance. Would we have prevented subsequent terror attacks since 9/11 if the Department of Homeland Security hadn't been created? That's a question for debate, but certainly having lots of resources and having lots of communication pathways and backstops to make sure that a single person's mistake doesn't result in a catastrophic attack being overlooked probably prevented quite a few incidents. We haven't applied any of those best practices to school safety. Schools are left on an island, and that's why the same incidents happen over and over.
Yeah, and it's a frustrating, it's a lonely island for sure. David, we're coming up on 7 o'clock here, but you know, Idaho State is a college campus, and there are college campuses all over the United States. In terms of the data, I know you're doing K through 12, but in terms of intervening at those causal event levels, is there anything that college campuses can do that we don't see happening in the public school system?
Yeah, talking about, you know, the threat assessment, or talking about crisis intervention and the crisis intervention cycle, that's something that is even more applicable at a college, because you know you have mature older teens or young adults, or even with graduate students and PhDs, older adults, and every single person on the campus has the ability to be really intimately familiar with their classmates, their roommates, their other people in their dorms, other people in their lectures, and realizing the opportunity to stop somebody from reaching crisis, to see somebody's behavior changing. A great example of this was at Embry-Riddle University in Florida, which is a premier aeronautics university, has a really high failure rate, as a lot of engineering schools do. And 2 years ago, right at the end of the fall semester, there was a student who was failing out. And you know that happens in these engineering programs. But what happened is, you know, he started talking about violence. He'd never been interested in guns, but he sold his car to purchase a gun, which, you know, is a pretty significant decision to make. And then he started giving his possessions away to friends, and that's also a sign that something's going very wrong. And then the night before final exams, he made some posts on social media in the middle of the night talking about, you know, get ready for tomorrow. And his plan was, Embry-Riddle has a large academic building that has a big open air atrium with some hallways and corridors that are overlooking it. And he had a compact folding rifle that would fit in a backpack. And he had that rifle and 6 fully loaded 30-round magazines. And as exams were starting and students were filing into that room, he was going to fire down into that atrium with this rifle. But somebody saw those Instagram posts at 3 or 4 in the morning. They immediately recognized that there was a problem, contacted campus police. This is what's really important. Campus police took it seriously. They didn't want to wait a day. They didn't wait to convene their threat assessment team. They said, we better track this student down right now. And campus police got him on his way to the campus, walking to the campus with the rifle and the ammunition in his backpack. And so that is where somebody recognizing crisis, there were missed opportunities because of a lack of education. People could have seen that he was failing and realized that he was going to need some kind of formal assistance with figuring out where his life was going from there. But even if they missed that, seeing then the significant changes of somebody deciding, I'm going to sell my car to buy a gun, that's something to watch out for. And then, you know, that giving possessions away. And that's something that's been a theme with high school and middle school and even elementary school shooters, is that they'll give their cherished possessions away before the attack. So just people knowing to look out for each other and having a place to talk, having a way to contact adults, and having that all be a frictionless, seamless system that doesn't exist now, but that can prevent a lot of this violence.
David, thank you so much. I have two more questions if you have a couple more minutes.
Sure.
And if you would just speak frankly about this, if you were king for a day, what three elements should we be seeking? National standards, police training, more mental health training? If you had the magic wand to solve school shooting problems, what would you suggest?
Yeah, that's pretty easy. It's actually 6 points that I have right here, and I'll just put them on the screen. I think that these 6 elements, these 6 elements can stop almost every school shooting and or make every single situation worse. And the first is creating a culture where there's an expectation for students to notice and report problems. And this doesn't mean snitching on somebody, getting somebody expelled, getting somebody arrested. That's the understanding crisis. And that student reporting needs to be combined with that formal crisis intervention program where you have these different layers. They have connections to resources, and there's a feedback cycle to know that things are not falling through the cracks. As I talked to earlier, secure gun storage in the home can prevent anybody who's not old enough to buy a gun from committing a school shooting. A 12-year-old, or even 2 years ago, a 6-year-old purposely trying to kill his teacher, a 6-year-old cannot commit a school shooting if a 6-year-old can't get to a gun in their home. So secure gun storage can prevent almost all of these incidents. And then at the school, really having a planned and scaled response that's appropriate to all of these different circumstances, something that is accounting for all of those different attack types that I went over, but also having a plan that's different for systemic spontaneous gun violence, like a fight that turns into a shooting. That needs to have a different plan and response from a deliberate attack on the campus. Because if a shot's fired in the hallway during a fight and a school has a multi-hour lockdown, even though the shooter fled immediately, you've now created a very traumatic situation for every other student in the school when they were never in any danger. Every single response needs to focus on saving lives and reducing trauma. And I think that that's something that's gotten overlooked in the amount of emphasis that's gone into creating all of these really formal structures around response. We've lost, and this was apparent at Uvalde, it's apparent in Parkland and some other incidents, that you need to get people care as quickly as possible. And there should never be a delay in getting EMS care and rapid care to your victims. That needs to be front and center in every single response plan, because seconds matter in a gunshot wound. And I think that the rapid transport of victims has gotten lost in a lot of the planning, but then reducing the trauma for all of the other students, not having students locked down for hours and hours and hours, not having elementary school girls go into the bathroom and trash cans in front of their classmates because police need to search every single room of the school after an accidental discharge in the bathroom. Understanding that there's an ability to reduce trauma on every single incident. And then the last piece here is the community needs to be involved. We can't think of school administration as being, and police being in one silo, students being in another, the community being in a third. Every one of these incidents starts and ends in the community. And every single member, people around the school, parents, relatives, nonprofit organizations, the youth groups and activities and businesses that students might frequent before school, during lunch, after school, all of them need to be involved in the way that you're going to plan and prevent and respond to an attack, because we have the same systemic failures over and over when school administrators or law enforcement try to do it on their own. It needs to be something that that entire community is invested and involved in.
You know what, David, these 6 points, it is an excellent example of what we talk about in our complexity theory class about intervening at the simple rules and agents level, that causal chain of events that you so expertly talked about in your recent article. So the last question comes from a student of ours, and we know that schools that are trying to deal with this complex issue are sometimes arming teachers. To the best of your knowledge, do teachers for schools that have passed this policy to arm teachers, are they receiving any additional training beyond the normal state training for their concealed carry?
That's back to the same point earlier, that there's no national standard. In many cases, there are no state standards. And then beyond training, the bigger problem is that there's not a procedural and legal standard for what an armed teacher does. And unlike a police officer, where the Department of Justice has a use of force continuum that says, the way that different behaviors will move up a continuum of force, with deadly force being at the top, and the types of behaviors from the suspect that would justify moving up and down that continuum, that doesn't exist for teachers. So you run into a number of issues where, when is a teacher allowed to shoot a student? So say a student reaches rapidly into their bag and pulls out an unknown object that they point at the teacher. Is that a point when the teacher can then open fire in the classroom at that student because they perceive that it might be a weapon? If a student, gets up and rushes towards the teacher, and that teacher is in fear for their well-being and in fear that, they might be disarmed, are they justified in shooting a student who's coming towards them? Those are really important use of force continuum questions that schools are arming staff without answering. And if you don't have clear answers for those, when somebody makes a decision, it's going to end up in court. And if the school has condoned that employee to carry a weapon, then that could be really catastrophic liability for the school system. But the broader idea of teachers being armed overlooks, the data that shows that most attacks are surprise attacks committed by a student. So a teacher is being armed to kill a student. And that's, I think, something that people are not frank about. And school shooters are as young as 6 years old. So when the student in Rich Neck, Virginia pulled a gun out of his backpack, is the expectation of an armed teacher that she's going to kill the 6-year-old student in the classroom? And what happens if other students are wounded in the crossfire? Is that just the acceptable collateral damage in the classroom? And unless people can give very concrete answers about those situations, then I think that it's creating far more risk than any possible benefit it would provide. And that's not even accounting for lost guns, for accidental discharges, for the confusion that you would have if there is a reported active shooter, and now you have multiple staff members that have guns out in the school. What keeps them from shooting each other? What happens from a substitute teacher that people don't recognize when they have a gun in the hallway? Or how does a police officer know who's who when they're responding? And that's not a hypothetical. At the STEM school in Colorado in 2019, there was a planned attack by 2 students, huge campus, and it occurred on one side of the campus. When the report of a shooting went out, there was an armed security guard on that campus on the opposite side of it. And as he was moving through the hallways, a plainclothes police officer came through a door. And so he saw that police officer, thought it was a shooter, and he opened fire in the hallway. He missed the police officer, but that armed security guard shot 2 students. So now you have an incident that became significantly worse because you have 2 more victims. You have 2 other people that are both reporting additional shooters. And that was because of an armed staff member who didn't do anything to benefit the outcome of the incident. He just increased the school's liability and resulted in 2 more students getting shot.
Well, you know, David, this brings our conversation full circle, because for our students, we talk about David Snowden's Cynefin complexity framework, understanding the level of complexity that you're in so you know how to act in it. And we talk about the unintended consequences of misinterpreting that level of complexity. We're all wanting to solve this problem and applying that, I hate to even use the word solution, but applying that remedy of allowing teachers in the classroom to carry guns is a fundamental mismatch to the level of complexity that school shootings are. David, I can't thank you enough. I just think that what you're doing is so profoundly important, and thank you for taking your time and expertise to share all of that with us tonight.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I hope everybody learned something tonight, and let's hope this doesn't happen again. But unfortunately, until there are meaningful changes implemented, we're going to continue to see the same cycle over and over.
Unfortunately so. So I just wanted to remind everybody that on April the 9th at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, we'll have another webinar with Kara Grongberg, who is the NFL Super Bowl intelligence expert, and we'll look forward to hearing more from her. So hope everybody has a good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight.